Hey Village, Tony here. So glad to be joining you for our weekly episode of the Village Recap. This past Sunday, Pastor Mauricio and Pastora Aleda preached a message to us titled, Rejoice in the Lord Always, coming from Philippians 4. And I don't know about you, but thinking about this encouragement from the Apostle Paul, thinking about this exhortation to rejoice in the Lord always. It may feel at times like a heavy burden, this encouragement or teaching to rejoice in the Lord always. If we think about it, with our daily lives, we already encounter and face so many difficulties, so many trials, so many problems, so many moments of sadness or suffering, so many moments of anxiety or frustration. And so now if we read it at a precursory glance, it almost seems like the Apostle Paul is calling us to an impossible task. As if if we're not careful, it looks like he would be making a mockery of our suffering, calling us to rejoice always in the midst of our trying circumstances may seem like a oppressive burden. I think you and I have often heard of well-meaning Christians who, when encountering somebody in a trying time or trying situation, will say, well, God has a plan for your life, and all you have to do is just, trust in Him and rejoice in Him always, as if this saying alleviates their pain or solves and addresses the circumstance they're in. And it's not meant to be trite. When the Apostle Paul exhorts us and teaches us to rejoice in the Lord always, what he is not saying is, hey, I know your life may feel like a shipwreck right now, get over it. He's not saying, hey, your life may feel like at its end, but it'll all be okay. Just be happy because God has your back. The Apostle Paul is not saying that whatsoever. The Apostle Paul is not giving the Philippian Christians a trite message, a band-aid. In fact, he's giving them a contrite message. His heart is filled with compassion for them. He is sharing their suffering. He is sharing and acknowledging the difficult circumstances that they are facing, because he too himself is facing a difficult circumstance. He too is facing immense suffering and pain. And so it's from his own experience of difficulty, it's from his own place of pain that Paul is able to say, rejoice in the Lord always. What Paul is trying to clue the Philippians into, and what he's by extension trying to clue you and I into, is a life found hidden in Christ, and a life that is made filled and made abundant with the presence of Christ. What the Apostle Paul is not encouraging us is to overlook the difficulties of our life. Rather, what the Apostle Paul is encouraging us to is to be cognizant, to be aware of how Christ has also suffered. And so that the Christian life is not a life absent of suffering, nor is it a life focused on suffering, but it is a life that is strengthened and sustained through suffering. And so that what it means for you and I to rejoice in the Lord always is to say that you and I are daily aware that while our lives may be fragile, the God of the universe also embraced this human fragility and showed us, especially through Easter, that death does not have the final word, sin does not have the final say, nor does suffering have our destiny. but rather because Christ himself suffered and was kept and was preserved, so too will you and I be kept and preserved in our suffering. And so what it means to rejoice is to find our joy in Christ and not find our joy in temporary, fleeting things. We are not to find our joy in material possession. I know I have quite a few books behind me, so definitely cannot find my joy there. We are not to find our joy in our wealth or our lack of wealth. We're not to find joy in our status, whether at work, at home, at church. We are not to find joy in hopefully our longevity or our finitude. Rather, we are to find joy in Christ. Christ shows us what it means to be fully human. And what it means to be fully human is to be somebody who in this life experiences suffering. To rejoice in Christ always is to see that the life of the human creature is not a life devoid of suffering and full of gluttony and pleasure, solely a hedonistic life. Joy is not hedonism, nor is joy happiness. Joy is you and I finding our lives, finding our purpose, finding the meanings of our lives in Christ. Finding how Christ has called you and I to die so that we might live. And so Pastor Mauricio and Pastora Aleda encouraged you and I in their explication of the Philippians 4 passage and of the Apostle Paul's encouragement to rejoice in the Lord always. Pastora Aleda and Pastor Mauricio showed us that life has its fair share of trials. But if you and I can place our joy and find our joy in Christ, we can continually and always be a people of rejoicing, because our joy cannot be stolen, nor can our joy be tampered with. Our joy is not inauthentic, but our joy is a realistic, honest joy, because it is a joy that is not threatened by the fragility of our lives or the changing of our life circumstances. Rather, our joy is dependent upon the one who never changes. Our joy is dependent upon the one who is always faithful and always true. Our joy is dependent upon the one who will always see us through, and that is Christ, because he himself has experienced death. And so, Village, would you rejoice always? Would you rejoice in Christ always? Looking at our DNA and discussion questions for this week from this recap episode. In your own words, can you describe what you feel it means to rejoice in the Lord always? For you, what does it look like for you to rejoice in the Lord? Joy, according to Pastor Mauricio and Pastora Aleda, is linked to kindness. How have you seen this joy in your life? How have you seen it marked by kindness? And how can you and I be a blessing to one another? How can we share one another's joys? How can we be kind to one another? And how can we share in one another's suffering? So glad to be joining you for this recap episode. I hope that this recap was a kindness to you. Looking forward to seeing how God continually moves in our lives, and looking forward to joining you on the next recap episode. Thanks so much.